Okay, great. Well, hi, I'm Jeff Bandman. I'd like to welcome all the attendees, either live or who will be watching the replay. And I'd also like to thank and welcome our special guest and my former Boston colleague, Tim Massad. Welcome, Tim.
Good to be here, Jeff.
Great. So before we get into today's discussion on the regulatory outlook and for 2023 and some of the issues we'll be diving into, give a kind of a very short bio for Timothy Massad. Timothy Massad is a non-resident senior fellow at Brookings, research fellow at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, adjunct professor of law at Georgetown Law School, and a consultant on financial, regulatory, and fintech issues. Mr. Massad also served as chairman of the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission from 2014 to 2017, where he had, I hope, the good judgment to hire me to work with him, which was a great experience. It's a highlight for my career, at least. Under his leadership, the agency implemented Dodd-Frank reforms of the OTC swaps market, harmonized many aspects of cross-border regulations, including reaching a landmark agreement with the European Union on clearinghouse oversight. Yeah, those were fun times. Chairman Massad also declared virtual currencies to be commodities in testimony before Congress, and introduced reforms to address automated trading and strengthen cybersecurity protections. And we'll dive a little more into Chairman Massad's background. And I'm Jeff Bandman, founder and principal of Bandman Advisors, which is advisory practice, helping clients meet strategic innovation and regulation challenges, focusing on blockchain, fintech, and regtech. I'm also COO for 6529 Capital and 6529 Museum, which is active in a number of areas, including a very extensive NFT collection, a leading asset manager in the NFT space, and an initiative to build an open decentralized metaverse. And I was formerly a senior official at the US CFTC, working with Chairman Massad on derivatives and also fintech issues. And we founded the first CFTC blockchain and virtual currency working group quite a number of years ago. So plenty to discuss in the present, but maybe if we could start our discussion today, Tim, just kind of looking back, maybe a little bit at what you did before you became the chairman of the CFTC, both in government and before you went into public service.
Sure. So before I became the chairman of the CFTC, I was at the Treasury Department. I joined the Treasury Department shortly after President Obama took office in early 2009 to help with the fight against the financial crisis. I was initially the general counsel for the Troubled Asset Relief Program, and then became the Assistant Secretary for Financial Stability at the Treasury, which meant that I was in charge of overseeing the Troubled Asset Relief Program. I spent 5 years at the Treasury responding to the wreckage of the financial crisis, and those were extremely interesting, challenging, difficult times, but at the same time, I really felt it was a privilege to be involved in that, working with Secretary Tim Geithner and then Secretary Jack Lew. Before I joined the Treasury, I was a partner at the law firm of Cravath, Swaine and Moore. I spent 25 years at Cravath, and that's obviously where, Jeff, you and I first met. And I had a very diverse practice, a corporate practice of transactions. I started my career, it's kind of ironic, on derivatives. I was very involved in the drafting of the initial ISDA swap contracts. I was part of a very small group of lawyers that worked on those contracts, drafted them. I drafted the user's guide as well, or I had the principal pen, I guess I should say. There was a group of us involved in doing that. I spent time running the Cravath office in Hong Kong, spent 5 years in Hong Kong, which was a great experience. Did a lot of work throughout Asia during that time. Was in the London office also. So I saw the world through Cravath, I guess. And before all that, I started had my first job out of college. I was an assistant to Ralph Nader. So that's basically the bio.
Oh, quite a story, quite a journey. That's great. And catch us up a bit on what you've been doing since
Sure.
leaving CFTC, and then after that, we'll kind of travel back in time and we'll talk about how digital assets first got on your radar screen.
Sure. So when I left the CFTC, I decided I didn't really want to go back to a law firm. I wanted to do a mix of things. I wanted to stay involved in at least some aspects of public policy, but also be involved in the private sector. So I put together a package of things. I became a senior fellow at the Kennedy School at Harvard, and then now a research fellow. I also became a limited partner advisor to a fintech venture capital fund, and I've continued doing that. So I advise some fintech startup companies and help the fund as it reviews new investments. I've done a fair amount of writing and public speaking, a lot about digital assets, as well as just some other consulting in the space, and a number of pro bono things as well. So it's been quite fun, and it's been nice to have this package of things. And at Harvard, it evolved from senior fellow to research fellow, and now director of a new digital assets policy project that we recently started, which is intended to both organize events and activities that are educational for people on campus, ranging from bringing speakers in to next week we're actually doing a 2-session workshop where students and others affiliated with the university can come in and learn how to create a digital wallet, how to create a decentralized autonomous organization, then issue your own token. So that should be a lot of fun. But we're also doing things to get Harvard in the public policy space. We hosted a roundtable on stablecoin regulation late last year that brought together basically 24 leaders, some senior officials from the Biden administration, leaders of stablecoin issuers, as well as people from traditional finance companies to talk about some of the tougher issues when it comes to stablecoin regulation. So that's kind of a little bit more background on what I've been doing. And of course, a lot of writing on this space. I've written a number of papers, several with Professor Howell Jackson at the law school, and we can get into talking about those, that Brookings has published on strengthening regulation in the crypto space.
Yeah, so definitely want to come back to those. Thought it'd be interesting for our viewers to hear a little bit of vantage point about how kind of digital assets first kind of came onto your radar screen. Obviously, you testified to Congress in 2014, which is 9 years ago now, quite some time ago. View that virtual currencies could be a commodity, and therefore of interest to the Commodity Futures Trading Commission and the Senate and House committees of jurisdiction.
Right.
How did digital assets first come onto your radar screen, and kind of if you take us back to how you thought about them at the time when you first spoke to Congress about them in kind of the early regulatory journey?
Sure. Well, before I got to the CFTC, I had certainly heard about Bitcoin. I was intrigued. But then when I got to the CFTC, it quickly came onto the agenda. And as you note, I did start talking about it and testifying about it before Congress in 2014. And of course, we officially declared Bitcoin and other virtual currencies to be commodities. I think that was either late 2014 or early 2015. And then we brought some enforcement actions. Now, that happened because there were market participants who wanted to do Bitcoin swaps. And the thing about the commodities laws that a lot of people don't understand, particularly with respect to, well, how did the CFTC come to declare Bitcoin a commodity? The law obviously did not specify that Bitcoin was a commodity. The law didn't say anything about digital assets. When you read the definition of a commodity, it lists lots of things that everybody knows are commodities: wheat, gold, oil, cotton. And then it basically says, and I'm paraphrasing now, but it basically says, and anything else that is used in a derivative contract. So the point is that if you have something like Bitcoin that people want to create a swap on, then the CFTC can view that as a commodity. And that is what we did, because that then gave the CFTC jurisdiction over those Bitcoin swaps. We could then look at the proposals for Bitcoin swaps and make a judgment as to whether we felt they were susceptible to manipulation, and also require them to be traded on registered platforms, regulated platforms. That determination, though, did not give us plenary jurisdiction over the trading of Bitcoin. The CFTC doesn't have general jurisdiction over the trading of commodities in the spot market. And this is a gap in our law that I talked about as early as 2014, continued talking about it, wrote about it after I left the CFTC. I'm still talking about it, and it still exists. And what that has meant is there's no federal regulator of the spot market for crypto assets that are considered commodities. It's only if a crypto asset is a security that then the SEC would have jurisdiction. And as many of the audience may know, whether it's a security depends on application of something called the Howey test as to whether there's an investment contract, whether there's an investment of money with the expectation of profit to be derived from the managerial efforts of others and so forth. So that's kind of the how it came about and how we first got into it. And as I say, we then did bring some enforcement actions, but we also approved Bitcoin swaps. And, you know, the thing about this gap in the law is when you understand the background, then you understand why it's not unusual. You know, I think other people think, well, why is it that we don't have a federal regulator of the spot market in Bitcoin? And I say, well, you know, it's kind of like cows. The CFTC can regulate cattle futures. It can tell people cattle futures have to be traded on a regulated exchange, but it can't tell people how to buy and sell cows or gold for that matter, or oil. Bitcoin is no different in that respect. The CFTC can bring an action for fraud or manipulation in that spot market. That's a very limited authority. And the reason the CFTC has that authority is because of the fact that fraud and manipulation in that spot market can undermine the derivatives market. But that's basically the extent of that authority. I mean, they have a little bit of other authority with respect to leverage retail transactions, but we don't need to get into that. So that's kind of both the background and a little bit on the law and why we still have a gap in our regulatory framework when it comes to crypto assets.
Yeah, and it is remarkable that it is for people to sort of, I think, absorb this, which, you know, from the CFTC kind of live and breathe every day, that, you know, this distinction between having supervisory authority, which would enable the CFTC to supervise, you know, a trading platform, a custodian, an intermediary that engages in the business with respect to spot commodities and spot digital assets. And, you know, in fact, you know, as you point out, you know, there, you know, for virtually every commodity, there is no federal regulator of, you know, kind of trading activity. And in fact, I believe the only instance in which that exists today is with electricity, where the Federal Energy Regulatory Commissioner, FERC, oversees that. But it would actually be, quite exceptional for there to be a federal regulator of trading and underlying an activity in a commodity. But there's certainly a lot of discussion. And, one anecdote about, the misconceptions, when I was doing some of the outreach in the context of the kind of blockchain and virtual currencies working group we launched under your chairmanship, I did a trip up to New York to meet with some of the spot crypto trading platforms at the time. And this was, again, this is, 7 years ago, which is, ancient crypto history. And so, I was kind of discussing markets and conditions with them. And, at the end of the meeting, they said, Jeff, you seem like a pretty reasonable guy. The CFTC is, seems like a pretty thoughtful agency. Would you guys be interested in, just regulating us? And, I had to explain that, it doesn't really work that way. And the CFTC can't just look around, and if it sees a market that would benefit from its supervision, can just sort of appoint ourselves to oversee it. That, Congress, allocates budget and defines authority and makes these decisions. But, nonetheless, and in fact, I mean, even, I've seen in the aftermath of the FTX, I've seen some commentators criticize, the CFTC for not having kind of supervised, the trading platform and the kind of collapse and, apparent, massive pilfering of customer assets. But, literally Congress has not given the CFTC that job, and the CFTC affirmatively can't do things Congress has not told it can do.
Yep.
Yeah.
No, that's absolutely correct. And, there obviously are proposals to provide the CFTC with the jurisdiction to oversee the spot market. I have supported the idea of giving that authority to either the CFTC or the SEC. My view has been either could do the job. We just need somebody to have it. And, I acknowledge that this would be an exception generally, as you pointed out. There aren't federal regulators of spot commodity markets, but I think this is one where we need it. A lot of the other commodity markets, they obviously evolved over the years. They started as physical markets. There are often trading rules, if you will, that have developed voluntarily. Sometimes there are state law requirements. So we don't need a federal regulator of the cattle markets, for example, in the same way. We have health type regulation and other type regulation. But I think, there is justification. Obviously, we've seen it now with the FTX collapse, for having a federal regulator of the spot market with crypto.
Yeah. So, what do you think is the outlook this year? Kind of given all the events of 2022 and years leading up to that. What's your sense of the outlook for congressional action in this area this year?
Well, it's quite interesting when you think about it, because you might think that because of the implosion of FTX and all the other failures we've seen, from the collapse of the Terra-Luna algorithmic stablecoin to the consequent failures that arose out of that, people certainly recognize that this is an industry which doesn't adhere to the same standards of transparency, of investor protection, of simply protecting customer assets that we have in the securities and the derivatives markets, for example. But that doesn't lead them to agree on what the solution is, because there are very different views as to the underlying problem. And if I can oversimplify, I kind of see about 5 different views of what the problem is today when I listen to people in Congress. There are those who think the regulatory framework was the problem, meaning, okay, there was this gap in the law. We really need to fix that gap. We need to have a federal regulator of the spot market. But there are others who would say, no, it was the regulators themselves. The SEC and the CFTC could have done more with their authority. They didn't. We'll certainly see some hearings on that. Now, that view is often expressed by people who have other criticisms of the SEC in particular. So it kind of, it will, I think, lead to some oversight of the SEC by Congress, particularly in the House, that will be aggressive. Then you have people that kind of say, well, it's not quite the gap in the framework. It's not quite the regulators. It's regulatory clarity. We just don't know how the rules apply. That's the problem. And obviously, a lot of people in the industry say this. Some people in Congress have then taken that up with bills to, kind of redefine traditional categories of securities and commodities to create new categories, perhaps. I get concerned about those approaches because I think it's very hard sometimes to do that in the abstract. I think there is a need for clarity of certain things, maybe of how certain disclosure rules apply to crypto, but I'm a little concerned about those kind of attempts to be comprehensive. So I think we're up to 3 views. The other 2, though, I see is, you've got a lot of people who would say, no, the problem is really crypto itself. It's the skeptics. Elizabeth Warren gave a speech yesterday that kind of reflects this view that basically the people who are skeptical of the value of crypto are even more skeptical now. They see very little value. They see a sector which largely just revolves around itself, doesn't really have any value to the overall economy, is speculative. And so they don't want to do anything that would legitimize it. And they see a lot of regulatory proposals as doing that. Instead, they just want more enforcement. And then I think finally, you've got people who say, no, crypto isn't the problem. Crypto is the solution. The problem here was, FTX was a centralized intermediary that was vulnerable to human fraud and negligence and error. And crypto's promise is to develop decentralized applications that avoid or at least minimize that. So those folks want to make sure that if we do anything, we don't undermine crypto's potential in that regard. So, with all these different attitudes, I'm not sure that Congress can quickly come to agreement on any action, particularly when we probably face 5 months of arguing over the debt limit. So we'll see. I mean, I remain optimistic that we might do a couple of things, whether it's appoint a federal regulator of the spot market, which I think would help, or do something on stablecoins. I think we do need a framework for regulating stablecoins. But, I think both those things can either come from congressional action or conceivably could come from just administrative action. And that's, the theme of the papers that Howell Jackson and I have written lately is what the administration can do on its own, what regulators can do today under existing law, not because we don't support legislation. We'd welcome legislation. We're just, concerned that it may not happen.
Yeah, well, that's certainly, I think you've really, it's quite an efficient synopsis of the different camps, and we'll see if this Congress, what things they can agree on, and I guess the question is of the things that they're able to agree on, will this be one of them? And it's interesting as you mentioned stablecoins, because of course in the EU they've passed a very comprehensive, regulatory framework, for both stable coins and for oversight of crypto asset service providers, which, I think to a certain extent, the catalyst was their concern about the risks of stable coins, and they were able to kind of bundle other things in there. And, it did seem like, prior to the FTX collapse, that there might have been some momentum, in the last Congress for legislation around, stable coins and the, spot market. But
Right.
that time has passed. So let's turn to, some of your thoughts, Professor Jackson, on, things that the, administration could or should do under, kind of existing authority. You kind of take us through kind of some of those areas, and
Sure.
if there are some that you think are particularly, low hanging fruit, as it were, that perhaps some administration officials could zero in on.
Sure. So one proposal is that the SEC and the CFTC should get together and basically create a self-regulatory organization that they would supervise, that would be charged with developing and enforcing standards for the crypto market, in particular for crypto trading platforms and other intermediaries. So the theory of that is, number one, the regulators have the power to create self-regulatory organizations. And by self-regulatory, let me be very clear, that has a particular meaning in the United States. It doesn't mean an industry organization that just goes off by itself and decides what to do and tries to regulate its members. It means an entity that is essentially recognized by the regulators and overseen by the regulators. The regulators approve who the board members are. The regulators approve the rules, the proposed rules that it comes up to with. The regulators oversee the entity's enforcement actions. And so we have a long history of self-regulatory organizations in this country. They basically started in the 1930s, shortly after the securities laws were passed. Under the then chairman of the SEC was William O. Douglas, who later became a Supreme Court justice. And the challenge he was faced with was the Securities Act and the Securities Exchange Act were, very clearly focused on, at that time, they were a little bit shorter than they are today. They were very focused on the securities exchanges and on the, on initial public offerings and so forth, but not really on the over-the-counter market. And there were thousands of brokers. And so Douglas basically developed the concept of a self-regulatory organization. But as he put it, this will only work, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, but he basically said, this will only work if the government has a shotgun, clean and well-oiled and ready to use, meaning, the government has to oversee the work of the industry and make sure it does it right. So that was formed, that is today what we call FINRA, used to be called NASD. And the CFTC has the National Futures Association. Those are very similar. So that's the concept. And the other part of the argument here is, look, we've been fighting over whether particular crypto assets are securities, or are they commodities, or are they utility tokens, or what are they? When you really think about it, though, with respect to the trading of these and issues about, customer and investor protection, the standards we want are similar, regardless of which bucket you put it into. We want protection of customer assets by these intermediaries. We want integrity in the trading, which means things like exchanges, trading platforms shouldn't permit wash trading, right? Wash trading is where someone basically trades with themselves to create the appearance of upward movement in the price or the volume. There have been studies that say wash trading accounts for 50, 70, I've even seen one estimate at 90% of the volume on many exchanges. So, we should prohibit that. We should prohibit front running by trading platforms. We should require disclosure by platforms if they have interests in tokens, or even prohibit them from having interests in tokens. We should have good, reporting of pre and post trade. We should have standards on operational resilience. So the idea is have the SEC and the CFTC come together and come up with these standards through a self-regulatory organization or simply on their own. Former SEC chair Jay Clayton and I, have also advocated this just on the basis that the two agencies could come up with this. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit there. I mean, you're not going to be able to maybe create the complete regulatory regime this way, but you could deal with a lot of low-hanging fruit. So that's idea number one. Another one is that we could create a platform for regulating stablecoins under existing law. And here, stablecoins, have grown to $150 billion market cap roughly because they've been very useful in the crypto space. They're on-chain money that facilitates, instant settlement. You can't, trade crypto on a DeFi platform using your credit card or a wire transfer. But stablecoins could also have broader application. And so the question is, shouldn't we try to bring this activity into the regulatory perimeter rather than just, keep it out, which is what the banking regulators to date have opted for. And so Professor Jackson and I have argued that we have the authority under the law today to create a way to do this. Basically, the banking regulators could create a framework using tried and true concepts. One is the concept of a national trust bank, which is kind of a limited purpose banking institution. And under it, you can have an actual trust vehicle. This is used in sort of collective investment schemes. And that trust vehicle could essentially be the stablecoin issuer. It would have the liabilities. The trust bank would be the manager of that trust vehicle. And that could all be required to be under, a full bank, an insured depository institution or not. But the banking regulators through that kind of structure could create an application process where a stablecoin issuer would have to come in. You could impose requirements like full reserves for the tokens, even requiring some capital. You could require other resilience measures, consumer protection measures, and so forth, and even impose requirements on the selection of the blockchains that a particular stablecoin issuer would support. Now, this would be voluntary, but we think that there would be sort of a package of carrots and sticks, if you will, that would make it attractive. One is simply being authorized, right? There would be a marketing advantage to a stablecoin issuer that say, look, I've been chartered by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. There might also be, you could also couple it potentially with access to a Federal Reserve master account or other aspects of the Federal Reserve payment infrastructure. That's very, very useful in settlement. We wouldn't provide deposit insurance because, as long as you have full reserves and you're not leveraging the deposits, you don't need deposit insurance. And there would also be sticks, basically, that the regulators could use to encourage firms to come into this, which are basically that their enforcement activity would be focused on those firms that don't take up this structure. There's a lot of other issues we can talk about there. How do you deal with state chartering and so forth? But we think both these ideas could be acted on. They require two things, though, that aren't always in great supply in our regulatory system. One is cooperation between regulators, because they require different regulators to get together and work together. And secondly, some creativity.
Yeah. Those are, I mean, well, those are both, very interesting and, sophisticated ideas. Maybe to go back to the self-regulatory organization idea first. I mean, we still, going back to kind of the framework that, either the SEC or CFTC has for supervision of regulated trading platforms, and, they each have a number of different flavors of those, right? But, they contain a lot of the safeguards that you've enumerated. Does this get you, kind of the fact that neither agency has statutory authority directly for the spot market? Could this SRO nevertheless be an SRO with legal teeth for, for spot market trading as well? Sort of how do you kind of, bridge that gap with this?
Excellent question. There is still an element of voluntariness to it. You'd basically have to, cajole the industry into doing this. But again, we think there's a kind of a package of carrots and sticks, if you will, that are involved.
Yeah.
Both the SEC and the CFTC could basically say, look, if you, to let's say a trading platform or an exchange, if you participate in this self-regulatory organization and agree to abide by the standards that it comes up with, and we're going to approve those standards, then we won't try to shut you down. In other words, the SEC won't bring an action against a trading platform trying to close it down. Now, it doesn't mean that the SEC would give up the ability to say, we actually think you're trading a security there. You really should go beyond this and register as a securities exchange, but they wouldn't shut down the exchange. You would just, try to work that out. So that's kind of the big, whether you call it a carrot or a stick, it's kind of both in a way. And, we think the moment is ripe for something like this. I mean, it's kind of funny. We wrote the paper before FTX imploded. I think the arguments for it are even greater today.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is a, kind of an expectation that, especially with certain platforms, that when customers or users sends their funds there, that those, are being safeguarded separately, that they're not being commingled with the funds. Certainly that there's, not being, I mean, no one expects the type of apparent, wholesale theft that appears to have be reported to have happening. And, with some, it seems with some crypto platforms, there may be an expectation of rehypothecation, which also occurs, in traditional banking, but of course in a CFTC regulated exchange with the CFTC regulated clearinghouse, the customer funds are safeguarded, and there's also nice integration, which I think Congress would have to do to get the integration with the bankruptcy code. But the distance between kind of user expectations and the practices is an enormous gap. So I think anything that addressed that would be,
Exactly.
What sort of response have you gotten from, to the extent you can, comment on it? What sort of response have you gotten from, policymakers or more from the industry, for that matter, on these proposals? Because there's obviously a number of important stakeholders here.
Sure. Well, all the conversations have been kind of, on an agreement that we wouldn't specifically refer to anyone, but generally very positive. People like the ideas. They think, wow, this is really creative. We'll have to see, though, whether they're actually taken up. I mean, it really requires senior officials to decide it's not only interesting and creative and kind of a really a good idea, but we're actually going to act on it.
Yeah.
We'll have to see.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And on the stablecoin proposal, do you think, it seems like one of the issues that comes up is that there's been this idea that gets advocated and debated, around the idea of a kind of narrow bank, particularly a narrow bank that has access to, kind of a Fed account or Fed window. But it sounds like in your, kind of description of it, you've kind of taken this issue into account and come up with a structure that operates a little bit differently from that.
Well, the National Trust Bank concept is essentially a narrow bank.
Yeah.
Because it would be focused on just this stablecoin activity. It would not be making loans. It would not be engaged in, what we call maturity transformation, where you're taking deposits and then, making investments or loans that are longer term. So it is a narrow bank type concept. Now, there's a couple of different variations. One, the way we wrote the paper initially was we said this National Trust Bank would be the subsidiary of an insured depository institution. So even though, you'd have standards that apply specifically to the National Trust Bank and its payment trust vehicle, so that, things like you'd structure it so that the capital requirements aren't huge as a result of the stablecoin. In fact, they're very minimal, even though it would be a subsidiary of the IDI. We proposed it that way for two reasons. One was that the report of the president's working group said stablecoins should only be issued by insured depository institutions. So we wanted to come up with something consistent with that, although by separating it from the actual IDI, by having it in a national trust bank, you get a lot more flexibility in how the rules would work. The other reason we proposed it that way was that by having it as a subsidiary of an insured depository institution, you automatically pick up the restrictions under the Bank Holding Company Act between business, banking and commerce, because a lot of people have said, look, stablecoin issuers shouldn't really, we don't want Amazon or Google being, some huge stablecoin issuer. But, there are other ways to accomplish that. You could actually just write in specific prohibitions on those types of commercial affiliations. And so, I think you could still do this without it formally being a subsidiary of an insured depository institution. And quite frankly, I will acknowledge that, I think that's the one aspect of the proposal that the stablecoin issuers have said to us, we don't really want to be regulated as an insured depository institution because we don't think of ourselves, we're not a full service bank. We don't want to be subject to all those rules. And, we really think of ourselves more as a technology company. So that's why we have, been open to the idea that it would really just be this narrow bank. You would have a specific set of rules, but, it still brings it within the federal regulatory perimeter. One of the other things it does, and this is really critical and people don't understand this, it would allow us to create a resolution scheme for stablecoin issuers. We don't have that today, right? If a stablecoin issuer were to become insolvent, that would be handled like a normal corporate bankruptcy. Most likely, there's potentially some exceptions there, but what that means is, as we've seen with FTX, you have, the appointment of a trustee and you have the automatic stay, and people are going to wait in line for a long time to get their money. If you did what we're proposing, you could have a setup where, like, the FDIC or the OCC actually is the resolution authority. and you could do it much more quickly. So, we kind of look at it as, as our other co-author, Dan Oury from Cornell said, it puts the stable back into stable coins.
That strikes me also as a very, very important, element that, a lot of people might not consider, but right, if these things are going to be used for payment, in the course of commerce or wholesale settlement or retail payments, you can't have just this long-term freeze of something, particularly if it starts to become, more broadly used in,
Right.
different parts.
And let me say two other things about stablecoins. The one reason I remain hopeful on, or one of the reasons I remain hopeful on legislation for stablecoins is stablecoin legislation can actually appeal to both the people who look at stablecoins and are very focused on risks and dangers, and the people who look at stablecoins and are very focused on opportunities, right? Because a good stablecoin legislation or implementation of our proposal administratively would address the risks by requiring full reserves, by requiring some capital, by setting some other standards for consumer protection and operational resilience and so forth. And by creating this framework of regulation, it would basically say, okay, we are going to allow this kind of activity. And I think, businesses would then be more apt to maybe experiment with stable coins. Other issuers might get into it. You might see traditional payment companies get into the space. So, I remain hopeful on stablecoin legislation in that it could unite those two groups. The other thing I will say about stablecoin regulation is I actually think the hardest issues are not how do we regulate the issuers of stablecoins themselves. They are how do we deal with the fact that these are transferred on decentralized blockchains, and how do we ensure prevention of money laundering, prevention of illicit activity, because the stablecoin issuer can do a certain amount of KYC on people that it deals with, but obviously stablecoins can then be transferred to all sorts of people. Those are challenging issues. I'm hoping that we can come up with technological solutions to those decentralized identification systems, where you have your identity credentials on chain, you can release them to, allow a transaction to go through, that kind of thing. But there are some significant challenges there.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's, the programmability, may create, opportunities that aren't there, that have not been identified yet. So,
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the programmability is one good reason why we should allow this type of innovation. I appreciate the attitude of the bank regulators. What we're seeing coming out of FTX, I think, is a view that, well, phew, this didn't create broader damage to the financial system. That's good. The takeaway I think they're taking from that is their strategy of trying to minimize the interaction between the traditional banking sector and crypto is what limited the damage. I appreciate the desire to minimize risk to the banking sector, and obviously we don't want crypto causing the next financial crisis. But I do think we have to be a little bit more creative in how we think about that interaction, and have to, generally try to bring more of this activity within the regulatory perimeter rather than just try to exclude it.
Yeah, that makes sense. And, we see on a number of fronts, whether it's, on the banking side, audit firms, that a variety of kind of service providers or vital function providers, are, I think are even more apprehensive about some of the, regulatory risks or scrutiny of participating in. But, I think that from an industry perspective, people who are trying to, build businesses and innovate and do things responsibly in the right way, need those, need those functions provided, right, in order
Right.
maybe as one last topic before we wrap up, you mentioned the workshop that you're preparing for next week, where I think you're going to do things with wallets, and you're also going to be, perhaps, did you say you were going to be doing some training with DAOs? What's
Yeah.
the what are you going to be
Yeah.
doing
So,
with DAOs, and what is the outlook
it's,
for those?
I'm very excited about this. It's a 2-part session. It's like an hour and a half each session. And we've got someone from MIT who's done this kind of workshop there coming in. And, first we'll kind of explain some basic Web3 concepts, how blockchains work. Some of that will be very familiar to students, but then basically walk people through how you create a wallet. And then, we'll give them a very minimal amount of funds, if you will, and then experiment with trading, and also then walk them through how you would create a decentralized autonomous organization and issue your own token. So I'm very excited. It'll be fun to see how this goes.
And what are you seeing, from your kind of, work with students, and, who've obviously they've grown up, much more, natively digital than, you or I, have. But, what is your sense of their attitude towards, digital assets and crypto and be your bank?
Excellent. Excellent question. I mean, obviously, this isn't held by everyone. There's some students who aren't particularly interested, a lot of students probably who aren't particularly interested, but there are a lot of students who are. I mean, there's a lot of interest and enthusiasm. And, that's the thing that I kind of keep coming back to in a lot of ways. And when I talk with regulators who, kind of are hoping this whole sector will burn out, as they say, go away. I mean, there's a lot of people, I think, in government just wish it would just all go away. I say, that's not going to happen. Sure, there's, what happened last year, a lot of setbacks. It's crypto winter. It's going to take a while to restore confidence, but there's a lot of interest in the technology. And that isn't just about making a gazillion dollars, it's because they really are intrigued with the technology. And I think that's going to continue. And, I'm now amused whenever I come across anything that talks about how, young people don't support capitalism or are skeptical of capitalism. And I say, well, just check out the interest in digital asset technology. I mean, there's a lot of people, some of these students, have turned down good jobs with traditional institutions to take flyers, with crypto startups. I don't know what better evidence you could have of an interest in capitalism than that.
That's great. Well, Tim Chairman, thank you so much. Really have enjoyed the discussion. Look forward to hearing, some of the outputs, if there's any reports for some of these sessions. And again, thank you very much for joining us today. Take care.
My pleasure. Thanks, Jeff. Good to see you. Bye.